Tonight, when darkness covers every corner and the only sound is the cold whisper of the wind, the scariest ghost stories will be revealed. Keep a dim light by your side, because what you are about to hear will make your heart beat faster and your senses tense up to the shadows that lurk in the night. Simon couldn't believe his luck when he stumbled upon the listing. A sprawling colonial mansion, tucked away deep within the secluded woods of Waycross, Georgia, with a price tag that seemed almost absurdly low. The house was everything Simon had ever dreamed of: grand, historic, with just the right amount of rustic charm. He had always wanted a place with character, a place where his family could grow, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Emily, his wife, was hesitant at first. There was something about the house that made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. But Simon was persuasive, brushing off her concerns as mere jitters about moving to such a remote location. After all, the house was a rare find, a steal really. What could possibly go wrong? From the moment they stepped across the threshold, Simon felt a chill, as if the air inside the house was denser, heavier than it should be. It clung to his skin, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The grand entryway was impressive, with its high ceilings and sweeping staircase, but there was an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up all sound. Even the echo of their footsteps felt muted, absorbed by the thick walls and dark wood paneling. Emily shivered as they toured the house, her eyes darting nervously to the corners of each room, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Lily and Owen, their children, seemed oblivious to the unsettling atmosphere, too busy exploring the vast, unfamiliar spaces to notice the strange stillness that pervaded the house. Simon reassured himself that it was just nerves. Moving into a new home, especially one as large and isolated as this, was bound to be an adjustment. But that first night, as they settled into their new beds, the house made its presence known. It began with a soft, almost imperceptible knock, a sound that Simon might have dismissed as the house settling, if it hadn't been so deliberate, so insistent. He sat up in bed, listening intently as the knock came again, this time louder, echoing through the walls. Emily stirred beside him, mumbling something in her sleep, but Simon couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He got up, moving quietly through the darkened hallway, his footsteps barely making a sound on the thick carpet. The house was cold, much colder than it should have been, and as Simon walked, he felt a creeping unease settle over him. The knock came again, this time from the ceiling, as if something or someone was moving just above him. Simon's heart pounded as he reached the foot of the staircase, looking up into the pitch-black void of the second floor. He hesitated, unsure if he should go up or turn back. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Then, just as he was about to step forward, the knock came again, this time directly behind him. Simon spun around, his eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing there, just the empty, darkened hallway stretching out behind him. He stood frozen, listening intently, but the knock didn't come again. After what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to move, his legs trembling as he made his way back to the bedroom. Emily was still asleep, her breathing steady and calm, completely unaware of the terror that had just gripped her husband. Simon climbed back into bed, his mind racing, trying to rationalize what he had just experienced. But deep down, he knew that something was wrong with the house, something he couldn't explain. The days that followed were uneventful, at least on the surface. Simon went about his business, trying to settle into his new routine, but the house seemed to watch him, its presence always there, lurking just out of sight. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something was just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for him to let his guard down. Then came the whispers. It started with Lily. She woke up in the middle of the night, crying that someone was talking to her, whispering her name over and over from the darkness of her closet. Simon tried to comfort her, assuring her that it was just a bad dream, but Lily was adamant. She pointed to the closet, her little finger trembling, insisting that the whispers were real. Simon opened the closet door, half expecting to see something staring back at him, but there was nothing, just darkness and the faint scent of dust. He turned on the light, showing Lily that the closet was empty, but she wasn't convinced. She refused to sleep with the light off after that, her small nightlight casting weak, trembling shadows across the room. A few nights later, it was Owen's turn. He woke up screaming, clutching his blanket tightly as he pointed towards the corner of the room. Simon rushed in, his heart pounding, only to find Owen staring wide-eyed at something that wasn't there. When Simon asked what he saw, Owen described a man tall, with a hood over his head, standing in the corner, watching him. Simon's blood ran cold. He checked the room, every corner, every shadow, but found nothing. Owen refused to go back to sleep, insisting that the man was still there, hiding in the darkness. Simon sat with him until he finally drifted off, but the feeling of being watched stayed with him long after he left the room. As the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent, more intense. Simon began to notice objects out of place. A chair moved slightly, a door that wouldn't stay closed, a picture frame that was always tilted, no matter how many times he straightened it. And then there were the mirrors. Simon would catch fleeting glimpses of faces in them, faces that weren't his own, twisted, grotesque visages with hollow, staring eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. The faces would disappear the moment he turned his head, leaving him questioning his own sanity. He began to avoid the mirrors, afraid of what he might see next. The house felt like a maze, its hallways longer and darker than they had any right to be, its rooms shifting subtly when Simon wasn't looking. He would walk into a room, only to find that it wasn't the same room he had left just moments before. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with an unseen presence that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Max, the family dog, was the first to sense the true danger. He started growling at empty corners, his fur bristling, his eyes wide with fear. Bella, their other dog, refused to leave Owen's side, lying next to his bed every night, as if guarding him from something unseen. Owen's nightmares became more frequent, more terrifying. He would wake up screaming about a shadowy figure, the blurry man who whispered horrible things to him in the dark. Emily noticed the change in Simon. He became withdrawn, sitting alone in the darkened living room for hours, staring at nothing, listening to the house creak and groan around him. His once confident demeanor was replaced by a deep, gnawing fear that he couldn't escape. The house was no longer just a place to live, it had become a prison, a nightmare from which there was no waking. Simon's concern turned to fear. He could see the toll the house was taking on his family. Lily and Owen were constantly on edge, their faces pale, their eyes ringed with dark circles from lack of sleep. Emily, too, was affected, growing more anxious with each passing day. She begged Simon to consider moving, but Simon refused to leave. He was determined to stay, convinced that whatever was happening could be explained, that it was all just in their heads. Then came the night that everything changed. Simon had been drinking, trying to drown out the voices that echoed in his mind. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and he could no longer ignore them. In a fit of anger and desperation, he stood in the middle of the living room and shouted at the top of his lungs, daring whatever was in the house to show itself. The house responded. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the air turning frigid as a dark shadow fell across the walls. The shadows twisted and warped, taking on strange, unnatural shapes that seemed to move on their own. Simon felt a cold hand brush against his cheek, and he stumbled backward, his heart racing as a figure began to form in the darkness. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with a hood that obscured its face. Its body was shrouded in shadow, its form shifting and changing as if it were made of smoke. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear that radiated from Simon. Simon tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, trapped in place as the figure advanced on him. He could feel its cold breath on his skin, its gnarled hands reaching out to touch him. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. The figure leaned in close, its face inches from Simon's. He could see nothing beneath the hood, only darkness, an endless void that seemed to pull him in. The figure whispered something, too quiet for Simon to hear, but he felt the words like a knife in his chest. The pain was excruciating, a searing agony that ripped through his body, leaving him gasping for breath. Simon's vision blurred, the room spinning around him as the figure's hands wrapped around his throat. He struggled to breathe, his chest heaving as he fought against the invisible force that held him down. The last thing he saw was the figure's empty, hollow eyes staring into his soul before the darkness claimed him. Emily returned to the house a few days later, her heart heavy with worry. She had tried calling Simon, but he hadn't answered, and the silence on the other end of the line had filled her with dread. When she entered the house, she immediately knew something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. She found Simon in the bedroom, his body cold and lifeless. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a final expression of terror that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The room was eerily still, the only sound coming from the curtains fluttering in the cold breeze that seeped through the open window. As she stood there, staring at her husband's body, she felt a presence behind her, a cold, malevolent force that watched her every move. Emily turned slowly, but there was nothing there, just the empty, darkened hallway stretching out before her. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift slightly, as if something unseen was still lurking, waiting. She knew, deep down, that the house had taken Simon, that it had consumed him in its darkness. The police couldn't explain what had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an intruder. To them, Simon's death was a mystery, an unsolved case that would eventually be filed away and forgotten. But Emily knew better. She could feel the house's presence, the darkness that lingered in the air, hungry for more. As she left the house for the last time, Emily glanced back at the towering structure. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness, but she knew the house was watching, waiting for its next victim. It had claimed Simon, and it would claim others. The house was more than just a place to live, it was a predator, lying in wait, ready to strike. If you ever find yourself standing at the threshold of an old, seemingly perfect house, and you feel that chill run down your spine, remember Simon's story. Turn around, walk away, and never look back. Because some houses are more than just haunted, they are alive, and they want you. In the remote town of Blackwood, where the fog hangs low and thick, there stands an old, decrepit primary school. The school, a relic of bygone days, had once been the pride of the town, but now it was a place of shadows and whispers, avoided by all but the bravest or the most foolish. The walls were cracked and crumbling, the playground overgrown with weeds, and the old oak tree in the center of the courtyard had long since died, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. There was a rumor in Blackwood, one that had been passed down through generations of students, whispered in the dead of night during sleepovers and campfires. The story was always the same, but with each retelling it grew more sinister, more terrifying. Years ago, long before the school had fallen into disrepair, there had been a girl, a quiet, shy girl named Lydia. She was often seen alone, sitting under the old oak tree during recess, her nose buried in a book. The other children rarely spoke to her, and when they did, it was usually to tease or mock her. Lydia, however, never seemed to mind. She would simply smile a sad, knowing smile and return to her book. One day, during a particularly stormy afternoon, Lydia didn't return home. Her parents searched the town, frantic with worry, but she was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the next morning that her body was discovered, lying at the base of the old oak tree. Her neck was broken, her eyes wide open in a frozen scream. The official story was that she had tripped and fallen into one of the indented squares that surrounded the tree, a freak accident. But the children knew better. They said that Lydia's death was no accident. They said that something evil had taken hold of her that day, something dark and ancient that had been awakened by the storm. Her death was just the beginning. Soon after Lydia's funeral, strange things began to happen at the school. Students will go missing, only to be found later, wandering the halls in a daze, their eyes glazed over, muttering incoherently about the tree and the girl. Teachers would hear whispers echoing through the empty classrooms long after the students had gone home, and the janitor swore that he had seen shadows moving on their own in the hallways. The worst of it, though, was the playground. The once lively space had become a place of fear. Children who played there would suddenly freeze in place, their eyes wide with terror, as if they were seeing something horrifying that no one else could see. Some would start screaming uncontrollably, unable to stop until they were dragged away by their teachers. As the years passed, the school became known as a place of darkness. Parents refused to send their children there, and the town council debated tearing it down, but they never did. It was as if the school itself wouldn't allow it. And so, it remains, standing silent and foreboding at the edge of town. Then, one autumn, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night in the school. It was a stupid, reckless idea, but they were young and bored, and the thrill of fear was too tempting to resist. They broke in through a window, their laughter echoing in the empty hallways as they made their way to the old oak tree. It was there, under the twisted branches, that they felt it, a cold, creeping dread that seeped into their bones. The air grew heavy, the shadows deepened, and the whispers began. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. They couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, vengeful. The ground beneath the tree began to shift and tremble, and to their horror, a figure began to emerge. It was Lydia, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and black. She moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, her head lolling to one side, as if it were still broken. The teenagers tried to run, but the roots of the tree shot out of the ground, wrapping around their ankles, pulling them back. Lydia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, a cold, dark wind began to swirl around them, filled with the tortured cries of those who had been taken before. One by one, the teenagers were pulled into the ground, their screams cut off suddenly as the earth swallowed them whole. The last thing they saw was Lydia's twisted smile, her eyes burning with an unholy fire. By morning, the school was silent again, but the whispers had grown louder. The town of Blackwood was never the same after that. The school was finally torn down, but the land remained cursed. No one would go near it, and those who did reported hearing the screams of the teenagers echoing through the empty air. And somewhere, deep beneath the ground, Lydia waits, her vengeance unfinished, her ghost forever haunting the place where she died, where she was taken by the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our world. In a small town where everyone knew each other and secrets were kept tightly guarded, there was an antique shop at the end of the main street. This small shop, with its old wooden sign and dusty windows, rarely saw visitors. But everyone knew its owner, Lady Goode, an old woman with a fearsome appearance, who often sat quietly in her shop, eyes fixed on an ancient book, indifferent to the passage of time. Among the countless antique and strange items in Lady Goode's shop, there was a particular mirror that no one dared to touch. The mirror was large, with an intricately carved frame featuring grotesque faces, and the glass was always clouded as if covered by a thin layer of mist. But what made it truly terrifying was the cold, eerie feeling it emanated, as if the mirror had witnessed things no one in this world should ever see. It was said that this mirror once belonged to a wealthy woman named Lady Arabella, who lived in the 19th century. Lady Arabella was famous for being the most beautiful woman in the region, but she was also cruel and selfish. She often used her beauty to take whatever she wanted, never caring about the pain she caused others. One day, a witch from the village, betrayed and had her lover stolen by Lady Arabella, sought revenge. The witch gave Lady Arabella the mirror, telling her it would keep her eternally beautiful. Blinded by the promise, Lady Arabella accepted the mirror without suspicion. However, when Lady Arabella looked into the mirror, she did not see her own reflection. Instead, she saw another face, old and full of resentment. It was the witch's face, and it began to speak to her about all the sins she had committed. Each word from the witch was like a dagger stabbing into Lady Arabella's heart, and she felt her life being drained away by the very mirror she had once desired. Lady Arabella tried to break the mirror, but all her efforts were in vain. She felt herself being pulled into it, sinking into eternal darkness. When her servants found her the next day, they discovered only a dried, aged corpse, as if time had sucked the life out of her, lying on the floor before the mirror, which remained pristine and undamaged. From then on, the mirror became a cursed object, passing from one person to another, each meeting a terrifying end while in possession of it. After years of wandering, it eventually fell into the hands of Lady Goode. Lady Goode knew the mirror's history well and always warned those who wished to buy it that if they dared to look into it for too long, they would see not only their own reflection but also the souls trapped within the ones who had been consumed by the mirror and never escaped. But as with all horror stories, there were always the curious ones who didn't believe in warnings. One evening, a man named Henry, a collector of strange items, decided to buy the mirror. Lady Goode tried to stop him, but Henry scoffed and paid a large sum to take the mirror home. That night, in his excitement and arrogance, Henry decided to test the legend. He stared at the mirror, smiling as he saw his own reflection. But gradually, his smile faded as the mirror began to change. Henry's face in the mirror became distorted, ugly, and terrifying. Then, from deep within the mirror, other faces began to appear twisted, pained, with hollow eyes staring directly at him. Henry tried to turn away, but he couldn't. The mirror held his gaze, and he felt an invisible force pulling him toward it. The souls in the mirror began to call his name, their voices cold and filled with indescribable sorrow. Henry tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. Bit by bit, he was pulled into the mirror, his body disappearing into the endless darkness. When dawn broke, the room where Henry had been was eerily silent. The mirror lay on the floor, still pristine and cold as before. No one ever saw Henry again, and those who came after were warned not to touch the mirror. But whenever a curious soul dared to look into it, they would feel a chilling cold and see the twisted, pained faces in the darkness, just like Henry, forever trapped in the world of the haunted mirror.